So this is our goal. We're going to stylize our type to create these playing cards, and it's going to deal with a lot of different things that we've learned so far. It's going to deal with the appearance palette, multiple strokes, multiple fills, the pathfinder, which we've already covered, and then we're gonna learn a new effect called the Gaussian blur effect. And the Gaussian blur effect allows us to see the drop shadow. And so that you see how this drop shadow here gives the effect of one card being in front of the other. So you can't do this type of angled drop shadow without creating it yourself. If you try to add, just go to like filter or effect or something like that and add drop shadow, it's going to be a flat, I don't know, custom, not even non-custom drop shadow that is going to be equal around the whole entire object. So we're going to learn how to create custom drop shadows and give it some realistic depth. And if you notice behind the text, there's like some faded kind of depth here. So it's dark in the middle, and then it starts to get light towards the outside. So we're going to do something like that there. We're going to create these shapes using the Pathfinder tool. And also the card will be with the rounded rectangle. And so this is the outline version of what you'd be creating over here. Okay? To start the concept of this, we're going to use this as our test. So we're going to take some text, stylize it, play with some of the stroke effects, and basically you're going to learn how to do this stuff so that you can ultimately get here. Okay? So let's get started. So I'm going to get a new document. Actually, I don't have to get a new document. I'll just get a new artboard. Create a new artboard. Zoom out. Where's my property artboards? New artboard. There we go. All right, so on this new artboard, what I want you guys to do is, first of all, if you have your appearance palette open, sometimes it can get in the way a little bit. So I'm going to drag this into my tabs up here. So when the box turns blue, you can add that to your tabs. If there's something in here that we don't necessarily need, like right now, we're probably not going to need a line, so I'm going to right click and close that. And transform, we probably don't need either, so I'm going to close that as well. So now we have our layers, libraries I'm going to close, layers, properties, appearance, and Pathfinder. So those are my main palettes that I need, and everything else I don't need until I do need it, and then I'll go to window and pull it up. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on this new artboard, and the way we're going to start is we're going to type in some text, and actually let's start off with the filter effects. So let's get a box, let's get a rectangle, and I'm just going to add this rectangle here. So this is going to hold my text, like I'm going to make a background to hold the text. So this is how we use our effects palette. I'm going to fill this with a color. So I'm going to go to my fill option, and it doesn't matter what color you choose. I'll choose green, and I'll also take the stroke away. No stroke. And just to double check my appearance palette, everything looks good, no stroke, and a fill. So if I go up here to Effect, and what I'm going to use is I'm going to use what's called a scribble effect. And the scribble effect basically is going to make it look like there's like a different type of pen applied to that shape, right? So if I scroll down to Stylize, Scribble, and then I turn on the preview, they have some defaults that kind of look like it's kind of written on or scribbled on here. And so this is on default. Then I have childlike, I have dense, I have loose, I have moire, sharp, snarl, swash, tight, and zigzag, right? So with this is actually kind of cool because you can play around with what defaults you like. And in the defaults, then you can go down and you can adjust to what you want.
Which what's our window?
Effect window at the top, and go down to Stylize, Scribble. So it's Effect.
Yeah, I don't have blurring edges.
You see it?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you can choose any of the default effects. And then down here, you can kind of play around to find out what they actually do. Got variation, got width, curviness, and so if you do something like curviness and then you have variation, you can see how that works out. So maybe you want something that's a little bit more whimsical like this. Okay. And so this is how you get, certain things here, and I can go back to change to the default and play around. But anyway, I'm just going to choose the default, and I'm going to change a little bit of the spacing just so it's kind of like you can see it a little bit more. And then once I'm done, I'm going to press OK. Now, the effects, anytime you do some sort of effect, there are two types of effects in your menu palette, right? You have the Illustrator effect, which is kind of like a non-destructive vector effect, and then you have the Photoshop effects, which are pretty much pixel based, right? So glowing edges and then brush strokes and pixelate. Those are going to flatten your graphics and make them more resolution dependent. But anything here from warp to 3D is all vector based, and it's not going to flatten your image, and you can modify the lines and things like that. So in your appearance palette, if you take a look at this effect, you'll see it here where it says scribble effect. And if you click on that term, it always can pull up your options so that you can modify. right? And so you're like, oh, you know what? I like this, but I want to do something else to it. So you can click on that and you can modify. You can also do multiple effects, right? So like if I have scribble effect there, and then I go back up, and let's say I want to do it again. I say scribble again, and it says apply new effect, and then I say okay, and then I try to do something here, and you know, sketch something like this, or snarl, you know, and then I press okay, and then now I have two, and now I have some grass or some, I don't know, looks like knit or something, some fabric, I don't know, but now you have two different effects applied to it, and if you hide one, I'm gonna have it selected, then you get that effect back. So it's a mixture of two effects. Whatever effect is on top, that's basically the latest effect. So it'll happen first and then second. So if you switch, sometimes you get a different result. If you look at my screen here, if I switch the effect from top to bottom, the effect changes, right? You drag one under the other, you get a different effect. So the layer order of these effects matter. So for me, I'm going to only use one. I'm going to choose one. So I'll choose that one. This one I will send to the trash. Okay. But the concept of that, the mindset that you can use more than one effect for a single thing and then have a combination of the two is really powerful. Okay, another thing is being able to, let's get another box and let's explore some of these other effects here. So I'm going to choose a box, go down here, and let's say I want it to do, let's see, we have stylize, we have drop shadow. I'm going to show you the reason why we're not going to do drop shadow in a minute, but we have a lot of these different things. Arc, warp, this is kind of cool. Like if I go to the warp options and I do, let's say flag. So with flag, it starts to warp the shape. Into this magic carpet type looking shape, which is interesting. Or a banner. One of the things that this is something that you can kind of get like depth, or at least a start of depth, pretty easily. So let's say, for instance, this was the angle and the depth that I wanted, and maybe I kind of do something like that, right? And then maybe like this. So this looks like it's coming down and it's going up and over, right? And so I press OK. From here, I can utilize this as sort of like a base and create on top. So like I can take my, let's say my pen tool, and we haven't really learned how to use the pen tool yet, but with the pen tool, what I can do is I can click, 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 and then go back to where you started. This is how you get shapes using the pen tool. Click, 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 click. But also, if you want to get more curvature shapes with the pen tool, you can click, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Now, this technique, if you can master the pen tool, then you can basically create whatever you want in your mind. But because of the new tools that we have available to you guys, you can really get away with clicking once, twice, 3 times, and doing something like this. And I'm going to change the color to like a gray. And now we have this curvature tool that allows us to do whatever we want. So this curvature tool says, okay, I'm going to pull this over here. I'm going to pull this over here. I'm going to make a point in the middle, drag it down, and I start to get what I need only from using the curvature tool. So you could literally not know anything about the pen tool and start to create. And so I'm going to take this and I'm shaping this, and the reason why I'm shaping this is because I'm going to add a gradient to this. So go to fill and select gradient, and then you start to get this shading that starts to happen, right? So I added just a simple gradient by going to fill and add this simple black and white gradient. And if you select the gradient tool, which is here, and you double click on that tool, your gradient options will show up, and you can start to control how that gradient affects the shape, right? And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the ability to have this kind of fade or react with the green below it. And so I'm going to take my black swatch here. This is the stopper, and I'll take the opacity and I'll bring the opacity down to 0. And if you want that opacity to be, slightly, I guess give it more shading or whatever, and I can maybe put it at 10% or 30% or whatever that is. And then basically what happens is I'm going to change my blending mode. Maybe just bring this over like this. I'm going to change my blending mode inside my transparency. It says opacity here. If I click on opacity, I have normal and I have the opacity, which is 100%. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to change this from normal to something like overlay, or I'll change it to multiply. And what multiply does is it takes the color that's underneath and it shines it through. And whatever's dark, it applies that dark value on top of the information that's there. So with that and the opacity of the actual shape and layer, you start to get something interesting. You start to get like this value that you can control. And so I can start to say, okay, well, if I have this shape and I have this at, let's say, 0, then wherever the gradient is happening, that's the point where it starts to interact and disappear, because whatever is this black part of the shape, I'm able to kind of modify and have it kind of fade into what I'm trying to do. And you can kind of see it there, but as it gets dark in this value, this is where you start to find the value that adds some depth or shading. So click there, bring my value up. Now, sometimes you'll get this line, and that's where the value is not really completely dark. So you would go into your gradient tool, and this is where you'd start to play around with how that gradient happens. Right? You can do sort of like click and drag in the angle that you think the gradient is supposed to happen, and you can move it, and this is where you start to kind of create that magic.
Wait, how do you get that line? Gradient?
When you have the tool selected and you select on the gradient tool, the line shows up. So all you have to do is just click and drag in either the right to left direction or the right, left to right direction. And because I wouldn't do it this way unless I'm using the actual green color. So right now my color, my gradient color is black. But if I took this, double clicked on it and turned that color to the green that I'm using, which is here, I think that's the green I'm using. Either that or that, can't remember. But whatever the green that you're using, if you use that color, then you're basically going from the color that you have into, you know, like a transparent color, or, you know, what, to white. So it all depends on what you're trying to do, but this is just to show you that you can use your color, like the start color, and you can change that value. Like, so if I put this at 100%, because this is the green color, make this normal, change this color to green, okay, and then I can change the white to 0%, and now you start to get a different look. So it just all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to get some highlights, you're trying to get some shadows. This green is really, you know, a little bit too green, but it's the same green now. So it's basically going from transparent into green, but it has like this white kind of shimmer or shine to it. And, you know, depending on how you utilize it, you can start to get some interesting effects. You know, normally your shine is going to happen at like the height area of something. So like, you know, you're going to get wherever it's going down like this, it's going to be more dark, and then whatever's coming up to the top, it'll be more shiny. Sometimes when you have that shine and it goes like that, this looks like it gives it some depth, so you can kind of play around with how this interacts with the shape. And if I zoom in a little bit, because there are two shapes on top of each other, it starts to add a little bit of depth to your image. And I can take this and just kind of play around with how this shape interacts. And if you do a series of shapes like this, you can start to really get something that looks realistic. And you can't really see it here, but when I show you the video, you'll start to see my screen a little bit better, and you can see how the shine starts to happen. So on that particular part, we're talking about utilizing the effects palette, the warp palette, or the warp feature to give you a start to depth. But to add depth, you have to utilize color, maybe gradient, gradient on top of gradient. So you have to have a multiple shapes on top of each other, and also stay organized in your layers, because you're going to get a lot of different pieces and parts of your layers once you start doing this, right? Because this one will be the shine or the highlights, and then you'll have something for shadows, and then you'll have the main shape. So make sure that you're naming your layers, and make sure that you're staying organized in groups and everything like that. All right, so let's get into the text. So far, you know how to warp things using the effect palette and warp. You know how to do stylize and scribble. Round corners, I'll show you. You can, and that's pretty much, you can play around with that. Outer glow, Outer glow usually works mainly when you have something that's on a dark background because you won't be able to see if it's on white. Inner glow, that's, you know, it says what it does. Feather, I can show you feather real quick. Let me just delete this part. And if I have my shape selected and I go to Effect, Stylize, Feather, what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to soften the edges. So what happens is, this is something, this is a good point on why you can use this or not use it, but what's going to happen is the amount of feathering happens based off of the slider, right? The different pixel value. But also, sometimes you'll get like a soft transition, or you'll get like a pixelated transition, and it'll look very rough. And so this, when you start getting into faded edges and things like that, you need to go up to your effect, and you have to select and check out your document raster effect settings. Now mine is at 300, and that means it's high quality, so it's going to be soft and smooth. But if I change this down to, let's say, 72, watch what happens. Well, nothing happened. But it should. Let me see if I do it again to something else. Actually, it did change slightly. You can't see it. Yeah. Yeah. You can't really see it on the screen. But what happens here at 72, you start to get more of a banding effect. And so it's not as smooth as a transition. And so, especially, you'll see it a lot more when you print it out. But when I go to Document Effect Settings, you want to try to make sure it's at 300. I'm going to put it at 150, and I'll put OK. Can't really see a difference here, but you'll definitely see the difference when you go to print out. So you want to make sure that that's at 300. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to make you aware of is that when you do apply one of these effects, you can always go and either remove it or hide it from the appearance palette. So the appearance palette is very powerful. Take that and throw it away. Okay? But this is cool because you're never really losing the shape that you have. You're just applying this thing. So let me undo, press Command Z. Now, feather is below the warp. But what happens if I put it, you know, above? So right now, feather is above fill, so it's not, there's nothing happening. So I have to put this below my fill, and then it becomes feathered. The warp is happening on top of everything. If I put it below, then it probably still is happening, but it put it on top so it can apply the warp to everything. Let me see what happens if I add a stroke color. So I added the stroke value, and it started to, because it's on top, it started to overtake this effect. Let me change the color to blue. So this is what's happening. So the stroke is being placed above the warp and above the feather amount. And if I try to take the feather, put it there, it doesn't affect it, right? So the order is important. The warp takes everything. Okay. All right. We're gonna stop playing with this. I'm gonna take the warp off and take the stroke effect off. I mean the warp and the feather effect. So take this off. Set my stroke to none. All right. Now, in the actual Photoshop effects, you have a lot of different things where you can apply brush strokes, an artistic, pixelate. You can do like a sketch, like a torn paper or chrome or charcoal, glowing edges, texture where it says mosaic tiles or patchwork. But when you do that, the Illustrator file gets a little bit different. It says could not filter the image because the selected area was empty. So okay, and then so what happens is I can either sometimes you can do it, but it has to have something to work from. So I'm gonna go here and just do let's do pixelate and let's say pointilize. Now I don't know if this is gonna work because it's just one solid color. So yeah, it's like it's not. Let me see. Let me take this. Make sure the fill is active. Effect. Pixelate. What about crystallize? Okay. And it's because it's solid color, it's not really doing much. I exaggerate it, press OK. And it just doesn't look like anything happened. These effects sometimes has to have other colors to work with, and like halftone pattern, maybe this might work. See, it pulls up this whole screen, and it really can't do much because it's just a solid color. And so sometimes there's no point to it. So like for instance, if I were to choose one of these options, I'd probably choose everything as a whole and try to apply the filter to everything, and then you'd get better results because you're trying to create an effect to the whole entire look and feel of the thing. So I press OK, and it gives me something like that. All right. So in a nutshell, this is the effects. You can play around with those and find out what do you like, what do you dislike, that type of thing. But what I really want to talk about is I really want to talk about the type. Okay. So I'm going to go over to my type tool, click once, and let's type in stylized type. And let's make that bigger.